This is Decision 2014. Tonight, a debate for State Comptroller. And now, live from City University's Baruch College, here is Time Warner Cable News New York 1 political anchor Errol Lewis.
Good evening. Welcome to our live debate in the race for State Comptroller. I'm Errol Lewis, and I'm joined tonight by Liz Benjamin, the host of Time Warner Cable News' Capital Tonight, Juan Manuel Benitez, the host of Pura Politica for New York 1 Noticias, and Jimmy Vielkind, the Albany Bureau Chief of Capital New York. Over the next 60 minutes, we're going to have an uninterrupted conversation about some important issues. The Comptroller's duties include auditing and reviewing contracts and payments, as well as administering the state's $15 billion payroll and overseeing the fiscal affairs of local governments, including those of New York City. The Comptroller also acts as sole trustee of the state's pension fund, valued at $176 billion earlier this year, and the Comptroller oversees more than 2,600 employees. We'd like to thank Baruch College for the use of Mason Hall and the New York City Campaign Finance Board for helping us organize this debate through the voter engagement campaign NYC Votes. And for all of you watching at home all across the state, you can weigh in on tonight's debate on Twitter using the hashtags NY1 Debates and TWCN Debates. And a reminder, this debate is also being streamed live on the web with no subscription login required. And in New York City, it's airing with Spanish translation on Time Warner Cable Noticias New York 1. So without further ado, let's introduce the two candidates whose speaking order was picked at random earlier today, Tom DiNapoli and Bob Antonacci. The format of tonight's debate requires each candidate to make 60-second opening and closing statements. The candidates will have 60 seconds to answer each question, and rebuttals can be 45 seconds long. 30-second re-rebuttals will be allowed at the discretion of the moderator. Candidates will also be asked a series of questions in a lightning round when only short one-word answers like yes or no will be accepted. Visual aids, prepared notes, and charts are not allowed. So with that, we're ready to begin with opening statements. And the first is, we'll start with you, Mr. DiNapoli. The most important part of your job is as the sole trustee of the state pension fund, with memories of the, opening statements.
I was wondering where you were going.
Very eager to get to the question. Go right ahead.
Good evening, and thank you for hosting this important discussion and debate. I grew up on Long Island in a middle-class family. My dad was a lineman for the phone company, and my mom worked as a clerk for the county police department. My parents taught me core values of honesty and playing by the rules, and those are the kind of values I brought to my service as your state comptroller. I inherited an office mired in scandal, particularly with regard to pension fund management. We've restored the reputation of the office and grown the fund to a record high value. We've also put a bullseye on public corruption. I know that's an important issue to people in our state right now. Working with prosecutors across the state, just over the past 2 years, our investigative and audit work has resulted in 80 arrests and over $12 million recovered for taxpayers. Making government more efficient, state government, local government, our audits have been very effective in uncovering billions of dollars in waste, fraud, and abuse. The Comptroller needs to be an independent voice with a priority on openness and transparency. I've honored your trust. I look forward to continuing to serve you as State Comptroller for the next 4 years.
Thank you. Mr. Antonacci.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'd like to thank Time Warner Cable News and New York 1 for putting on this debate, as well as the staff and the volunteers of Baruch College. There are many people behind the scenes working on this debate, and it's very much appreciated. It is an honor and a privilege to run for New York State Comptroller. I'm a lifelong resident of New York State. I grew up in Syracuse, New York, attending Lemoyne College, where I received my BS in accounting. I then went on to Syracuse University and received my law degree. As a CPA, I think I bring a unique skill set to the Office of State Comptroller. I currently serve as the Onondaga County Comptroller, and I understand what this job entails and what it needs to do to help save New York. I'd like to thank my family back home in Syracuse for their full support, my wife Michelle, my son Bobby, who's been on the campaign trail with me, and my daughter Jackie. It has been a great experience, and I want to also thank Tom DiNapoli, who is a gentleman for debating tonight. He's up 30 points in the poll, has an enormous money lead, and he still agreed to debate, and that's important for us to save New York.
Okay, thank you. Okay, and now to the questions. Mr. DiNapoli, the most important part of your job is as sole trustee of the state pension fund, and with memories of the real estate crash and the recession still fresh in many minds, and given even the recent slump in the stock market, including today's drop, what steps would you take as Comptroller if reelected to minimize risk and maximize return for retired state employees?
Well, I think you're right. Management of the pension fund is a key responsibility, one of many. What we always try to do is focus on our asset allocation and put a priority on diversification so that, in fact, we can reduce risk. In fact, we've incorporated risk management as a key part of our pension fund operations, actually creating a position that focuses on risk management. I think the strength of our fund has been our diversification. That's why we were able to recover more rapidly than many other pension funds. It's why we are recognized as among the best funded pension funds in the country. Moody's just in the past week or so put out a report of the 25 largest pension funds in the country. The New York Common Retirement Fund, for which I'm the trustee, was rated as the best. We have the best 10-year return. So I think we've been doing it right. We're reviewing our asset allocation right now so we can be better positioned for the future. Our goal is to continue to be a well-funded pension fund so we could continue to fulfill the promise of retirement security to our public retirees and public workers who hope to be retirees.
When retirees see some of the scary headlines, like, again, today's drop, which is really sort of part of a several-day slump, should they be concerned about that, or is that something that is just kind of the natural ebb and flow of the market?
Well, you know, of course, we're not day traders, right? So one day in and of itself does not value the fund. And the reason we put a priority on diversification is that we do not want to be completely exposed to the vagaries of the stock market. That's why we have put even more in terms of alternative investments, ways that we can invest in opportunities that are not correlated to the public markets. And of course, fixed income continues to be an important and significant part of our portfolio because of the safety that's there. So again, I think the strength has been broad diversification, having a professional investment staff, working with advisors and consultants who are very skilled, and I think the numbers speak for themselves. We're the best funded of all the big state plans. We're the best funded in the country. We have a great track record, and that comes with a lot of hard work and a lot of professional attention.
Mr. Antonacci.
Well, I would say to the retirees, most of which who live in Florida, they've all retired there because they're fleeing our tax state. I would say don't worry about those headlines because it's backed up by the good faith and credit of all the taxpayers of the state of New York, and therein lies the problem. Mr. DiNapoli at this time is moving more of the funds to hedge funds, which are certainly more riskier and more costly. In fact, under Mr. DiNapoli's watch, investment fees have gone up over $400 million. And also, we're not honest about the discount rate that the pension fund is using. If we had a more conservative discount rate, and again, as a CPA, we're taught about conservatism, we would actually have a bigger problem than we really do. But that doesn't sell well in a campaign year. So we have an overly high discount rate. It's too rosy, and we have to make some fundamental changes to the pension fund, including talking about a defined contribution plan.
Well, say a little more about that. According to your reading of where the pension fund stands, where are the sort of the risk points, and what is the real value of the fund?
The last data point for the unfunded liability of the pension fund was $20 billion. That's 20 billion with a B, and that's a big amount of money. And that's using the current discount rate of 7.5%, which the current controller has not obtained in his 7 years on the job. He has not returned that kind of money to the fund. So it could be anywhere up to $80 billion on the research that I've done, and that's big money. The problem again is the taxpayers are going to back this up, and until we have real talk about a defined contribution plan, we're going to continue to see the tax spikes that we see. In Onondaga County alone, where we have one of the highest bond ratings in the state, we just passed the budget unanimously with no tax increase. We've had over $20 million taken from our county for the pension contribution.
I'll give you a chance to respond.
Well, I mean, there's so much there. First of all, 80% of our retirees live here in New York State. They're not living in Florida. And we have put a priority on transparency. We disclose fees more fully than has ever been done before. And if you look at the amount of fees that are charged for our pension fund, we are below the median for all public pension funds. We are very, very efficient. 65% of our holdings are actually managed in-house. So this notion that somehow this is a fund that's not well managed, you know, the numbers just don't prove that out. For 2 years in a row now, we've cut the contribution rate to our government employers. We went through a tough time, but that tough time, when the market collapses, no excuse to do a retreat on retirement security. Moving to defined contribution will put more and more New Yorkers at risk of not having adequate income in their golden years. That would be a bad choice for New Yorkers.
We'll come back to that question in just a little bit, but I mean, on the question of promising or assuming 7.5% return, if the fund is not getting that return, is that an unfunded liability?
Well, you know, again, look at the Moody's rating. You know, our 10-year average was 8.67, 20 years over 8%. We had a higher assumed rate of return a few years ago. During my tenure, we actually dropped from 8% to 7.5%. 7.5% is still somewhat typical, probably on the mid to lower end for public pension funds. We are now going through an asset allocation and review. We will look at our actuarial assumption. It is possible that if we adjust it, we will lower it. But the numbers that we're using are very consistent with what public pension fund management is all about. And again, we get the great returns. We get numbers, and we have a funded status that outpaces virtually every other pension fund in the United States of America.
Okay, thank you. Liz.
Mr. Antonacci, you are the lone participant in the state's brand new pilot program for public campaign financing. It looks like you may not make the cut for matching funds. So the most recent report indicates that you are about $50,000 short. Is that in fact the case?
That's a fair statement.
Okay. So was it a mistake, do you think, to agree to participate in this and to be the guinea pig, if you will, in this experiment, this short-lived experiment maybe? Or was the deck stacked against you the way that the whole system was set up and really so rapidly?
No, it was not a mistake for me to enter the race. I've enjoyed every minute of it. You know, I'm a kid that grew up on the north side of Syracuse. My mom and dad were hard workers. My dad was a UAW worker at New Venture Gear Chrysler. Mom had a small business. You know, we didn't grow up, we don't have $1 million. And to say to little Johnny or little Susie that the main credential to run for public office is you have to have somebody in your family that can give you $1 million to run for office is just not part of the American dream. So I'm happy that I participated. You know, maybe it came out too late. Maybe we just didn't have the right infrastructure. I'm not going to make any excuses, but I believe that public financing can definitely give people an opportunity to run. It can encourage candidacy. It can encourage new blood. And we have to do something to shake up the Incumbency Protection Agency in Albany. We have to change the way we do business in this state, and perhaps public financing could lead the way.
So just to be clear, I mean, despite the fact that this perhaps isn't going to work out for you, which it appears that you're acknowledging, you would encourage its expansion, which puts you at odds with a number of your Republican colleagues.
Well, yes, it does. The Republican Party is generally not a fan of public financing. Neither is the Conservative Party, and my constituency has made that clear. But this campaign is tough to fund anyway. When you say expansion, I think that's a topic for another day, but certainly the Comptroller's office, the fact that you're the sole trustee of the pension plan, if there's any office that lends itself to public financing, it's the Comptroller's office. So I think I would stay certainly on that track.
Mr. Napoli, you basically had advocated, just as Mr. Antonacci suggested, that this office would in fact be good for a pilot program. You didn't agree with the way it came together at the end. You weren't consulted. At this point, the failure of your opponent to actually qualify, does this make you rethink your support for the idea?
No, not at all, just the opposite. At the time that I chose not to participate, I said not only was it unfair to me to change the rules so late in the game and to have to start over again, it wasn't fair to anybody who would be challenging me. And unfortunately, my opponent's experience validates those concerns that we had. It came in too late. The thresholds were too high. The rules didn't come out fast enough. The proposal we had would have been on the books well before 2014. It would have had a level playing field and a fair opportunity for a challenger or for myself to participate. What I hope does not happen as a result of this election is that people who are against public financing say, see, it didn't work. I think it was set up, whether it was set up intentionally to fail or not, certainly it was clear it was going to fail. This should not be an excuse for us to retreat from comprehensive campaign finance reform, lower limits, and public financing for state legislative races and all the statewide offices.
To be clear, do you believe it was set up to fail, just so those folks who believe that this shouldn't go forward, in fact, could point to it to say that it shouldn't?
I wasn't in the room with the folks that decided it. Whether it was done to fail, whether it was done to send a message to the current controller, I don't know the reasons, but
we will get back to that.
It just didn't make sense from the beginning. And again, unfortunately, the experience is such that I think the concerns I expressed at the time that I said I couldn't participate have been proven. The reason I didn't participate, I didn't want to validate what I thought was just a very flawed system.
Right.
And that's why I didn't get into it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Juan Manuel.
Thank you. Mr. DiNapoli, your rival is currently the Comptroller of the Onondaga County. As State Comptroller, do you have to work with him? Do you think he's done a good job? And do you think he's qualified?
Well, he's a gentleman, and I admire anybody who in this day and age is still willing to go before the voters and do public service. I admire anybody who wants to be a controller, because it's a great job. We have had occasion to talk, and obviously we are always very concerned about what's happening in our local governments. The position of controller is deliberately an elected office in our state because the fundamental is independence. And so there really aren't qualifications per se. It's the voters who determine who's qualified. Certainly he's a credible candidate. I certainly think I'm a credible candidate. The voters will decide who's better prepared to fulfill the responsibilities of being state controller.
At any point you had to work with him closely?
We've had conversations. We know each other over the years. So obviously, just as my office is independent, his is as well. His is focused particularly on the needs of his home county. So I don't think we've audited your office of late, so we haven't worked together in that context. So he's a gentleman.
Thank you. Mr. Antonacci, yes.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, Tom's a nice guy. We've gotten along. I will say that I'm disappointed in a decision that Tom made where I asked him to be deputized. I had an issue with one of our local development companies, and I wrote a letter to the controller, and I asked for my office to be given some powers to audit that local development company. And in fairness, Tom called me up on the phone, gave me his decision. I don't agree with it, but at least he had the courtesy to call up and talk about it. So that's something where we tried to work together. We just recently issued an audit, I'd say within the last couple months, in which we sent a referral to Mr. DiNapoli's office, and we did get back a prompt answer. So we have worked together.
Mr. DiNapoli, can you clarify what happened?
On that point, controllers have to work with attorneys, and our counsel advised us that I have no power to delegate my powers to another controller. But certainly if there's an opportunity to work together, if he would like us to do an audit, we are certainly open to that. But I can't delegate my responsibilities to somebody else. So I am advised by counsel.
And Mr. Antonacci, you've run in the past for Congress, you've run for Attorney General, or you tried, and now you're running for State Controller. Is this some sort of consolation prize for you on your political aspirations? Or do you have a vision, a political vision for the state?
Well, 4 years ago, I did dip my toe in the ring to talk about the controller's race at the time, because again, I understand the effect that the state has on county governments and local governments due to unfunded state mandates. And at that point in time, a very credible candidate by the name of Harry Wilson kind of knocked me out of the ring, and there was nobody that was looking to run for Attorney General. So the party, again, at that time, had asked me to review that case, and I lost at the convention. But I never ran for Congress. I actually evaluated Congress. Again, I was asked by the party, and I think I have the record and the experience that lends itself to a party leader coming to me and saying, hey, will you consider? This was absolutely not a consolation prize. This is a very, very important office, and again, my skill set fits right in, and I'll make a heck of a New York State Controller.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Jimmy.
My question is for you, Mr. Antonacci. The Comptroller's office has now helped 2 sitting assembly members be rung up for per diem abuse of the system by which they're reimbursed for expenses while they're in Albany. In 2012, the Comptroller's office approved a confidential settlement regarding 2 young women who claimed they were sexually harassed by Assemblyman Vito Lopez. He has since resigned. I'm wondering, what do you feel your office, the Comptroller's office's role is in scrutinizing spending by our state legislators? And are there changes you would make if elected?
Well, 4 years ago, my opponent, Mr. DiNapoli, sat on this stage and talked about how he couldn't enforce receipts being given by state legislators. And here we are 4 years later with an indictment of Assemblyman Scarborough. So in some respects, I think Mr. DiNapoli could have been much more vocal over the last 4 years to not only catch the perpetrators, but to prevent it from happening in the first place. It's very easy to go in and see money that is stolen after the fact. It's how do you set up internal control apparatuses so the money is not stolen in the first place. So I would put that on Mr. DiNapoli's record that he could have been more vocal with the state legislature. And again, he was a member of that state legislature for 22 years. He could have put more reform in. He could have put his foot down as the controller and stopped that from happening in the first place.
Mr. DiNapoli,
well, he's giving me more years in the legislature than I was there, but so much for accuracy. The per diems are set by law by the respective houses of the legislature. I can't change those requirements. We review per diems as we do other payments. The fact that, as you pointed in your question, Jimmy, we have 2 legislators sitting legislators, who one was sitting, one still is, who were indicted. That came out of the work of our office. The message is clear. There are rules. We could argue whether the rules should be tighter or not, but if you break those rules, we're going to find out, we're going to work with prosecutors, and you're going to be indicted. That's a pretty strong message, I think, to the members of the legislature. You better do it right, and maybe you should look at your rules and make them tighter.
This has come up over the course of your term, this term as comptroller, and I believe in 2012 a spokeswoman for your office said that you would look broadly at this, but then in 2013 a newspaper reported that there had been no broad-based review. We are hearing reports that are questionable by some lawmakers, some of whom have not been scrutinized by prosecutors. Have you undertaken a broad-based review of this?
You know, I think the facts speak for themselves. I don't know of any other controller in anybody's memory who's been on top of the per diems where elected officials have been indicted and charged because of how they have misused the per diem system. If that's not being on top of it, and we do it in a careful way, we don't do it in a cavalier way, we're not picking and choosing. If we find a problem, we work with prosecutors because we're not prosecutors. I'm not a cop, but if you're doing something wrong, we're going to follow the trail, we're going to work with prosecutors and see that you're charged. And when you're doing it that way, you have to cross every T and dot every I so that you're doing it right. And we are doing it right. We're continuing to review payments in this area, and if we find others who are violating the rules on per diem, they're going to be hearing from the prosecutors as well.
I'd like to just add to the other part of your question, the Vito Gropez scandal. Mr. DiNapoli paid that fund out, and it was disguised as a consulting fee or a legal fee when in fact it was a settlement. I think he could have done a lot more on those type of situations. And I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I can tell you that any female staffer in Albany is going to have a voice to, you know, they're going to have an ear with me if they need some help, and we're not going to let that stuff happen on my watch.
Comptroller, do you have any, would you approach that differently now? Can you address why you approved that settlement?
There are settlements that come through our office. Our responsibility is to make sure that if the settlements are legally agreed upon, that they're paid. I absolutely agree. Women were victimized in this situation. We should not lose sight of it. Working with their attorneys, they came up with a settlement agreement. It was, I feel that was the agreement for them to be compensated for how they were treated. We can't pick and choose when there's a legal settlement. And what we try to do as far as the transparency is make sure it's clear, because there are no secret payments, clear when a payment involves a settlement. That's been an upgrade to the system that I've implemented.
But your office has stopped payments. You have looked at certain state payments and contracts, and you have stopped them.
Well, if there's fraud, sure. If there's a complete misrepresentation of the facts, if there's a payment going to a vendor that has some vendor responsibility issues, absolutely. But if there's a legally entered into settlement agreement, you know, our responsibility is to make sure that it is legal, the money's there, any tax consequences have been accounted for. Our administrative role is not to make a policy choice for the state agency as to whether or not that settlement is appropriate. That's something that the counsel in that respective agency has to do, whether that's something that comes from the Court of Claims, Division of Human Rights, the state legislature, or other agencies. They're the ones who are responsible with their counsels in terms of negotiating these settlements, not our office.
Mr. Anacci, do
you can't
agree with
brag
that
on
approach?
Monday that you're the controller and you can stop things and do things and push pension companies around. You can't do that on Monday and then on Tuesday say, well, I really can't do anything about that. That Vito Gropez scandal was poorly handled. He could have stopped the settlement. We're still paying for that scandal right now. We're still cutting checks to those attorneys. And in fact, Mr. Gropez may not even have enough money to pay the settlement to the victims, and the New York State is going to have to do it, pay that settlement. Even more money.
A controller cannot pick and choose on a valid payment that's submitted by a state agency. That's a very dangerous notion that the controller is going to sit there and make judgments when there's the money there and it's legal. We are not the office to make policy choices or to make these kinds of legal determinations. When there's fraud, when there's malfeasance, when there's corruption, those are the instances where there's a valid reason to stop a payment or to stop a contract to review it. But you cannot pick and choose in an arbitrary way. That is not the responsibility of a responsible controller.
Well, clearly a point of disagreement, but thank you.
Okay, thank you. Now it's time for our lightning round. That's when I'll ask the candidates a series of questions where the candidate will generally only be able to answer yes or no or another short answer to each question. We'll start with you, Mr. Antonacci. Have you ever voted for someone outside of your political party?
Yes.
Mr. DiNapoli.
Yes.
Mr. DiNapoli, have you ever bet more than $50 at a New York casino?
No.
Mr. Antonacci.
No.
Mr. Antonacci, Bills, Giants, or Jets?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Bills, Giants, or Jets?
I'm a fan of football, but I'm Bills.
Mr. DiNapoli.
Bills. Only New York team.
That's right.
Mr. DiNapoli, now that it's legal, is medical marijuana a good investment?
A good investment? I'm not aware that we made any pension fund investments there, so I don't have any answers to whether it's a good investment.
Mr. Antonacci.
No.
Mr. Antonacci, have you ever been to Italy?
I'm sorry, I'm having a tough time hearing.
Have you ever been to Italy?
Italy, the motherland. I have not, but my mother has.
Mr. DiNapoli.
Absolutely.
Okay. Mr. DiNapoli, before becoming controller, did you pick your own stocks for your personal portfolio?
Well, I must say, the short answer, I guess, is yes. The longer answer is I work for AT&T, so we had a stock buying plan, and I continue to manage that portfolio.
Mr. Antonacci.
Yes.
Mr. Antonacci, do you intend to read Governor Cuomo's new book?
No.
Mr. DiNapoli.
I'm assuming it'll be a Christmas present, and then I will read it.
Mr. DiNapoli, have you ever bounced a check? Personal check.
Not that I can recall.
Mr. Antonacci.
No.
Mr. Antonacci, have you ever attended a same-sex wedding?
No.
Mr. DiNapoli.
Yes.
And Mr. DiNapoli, do you own a suit that costs more than $500?
With gift card and coupons, I do have one Brooks Brothers suit, but this is Macy's, I think, for about $200.
Mr. Antonacci.
No, I don't.
Okay. Mr. Antonacci, do you do your own taxes?
Yes.
Mr. DiNapoli.
I use a CPA.
I'll give you a good rate, Tom.
Mr. DiNapoli, do you usually carry more than $100 in your wallet?
Yes.
Mr. Antonacci.
No.
Mr. Antonacci, should the state have a constitutional convention?
Yes.
Mr. DiNapoli.
No.
Mr. DiNapoli, was Mario Cuomo a better governor than Andrew Cuomo?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Was Mario Cuomo a better governor than Andrew Cuomo?
In 2014, Andrew Cuomo was a better governor.
Mr. Antonacci.
Yes.
Mr. Antonacci, do you write your own tweets?
I write the majority of my own tweets. I do have an incredible guy that helps me out, and we speak together and we work together. But yes, I do my own tweets.
Tom DiNapoli.
Once in a while.
Okay. And Mr. DiNapoli, can you change your own oil?
Can I
Change your own oil. Vehicle question.
Well, I used to, but I get a coupon, and for $24.99, it's easier to go to.
But you could.
Yeah, to the place
Mr.
down the block.
Antonacci.
No way.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much. It's time now for more questions, and I'm going to start with Bob Antonacci. Mr. Antonacci, New Yorkers have heard many ideas for ways to revive the upstate economy, from casino gambling to tourism to hydraulic fracturing. What do you consider the most promising strategies for improving economic conditions upstate? And are there any ideas being attempted that you think just will not work?
Well, the first thing we need to do is eliminate the unfunded state mandates that continue to plague the upstate governments. And once we free up those governments to invest in their communities, including infrastructure, that will be the impetus to create jobs and help private industry flourish. I am a fan of hydrofracking. I think Mr. DiNapoli is not, one of our differences. And I also believe that, I don't believe that casino gambling is the future, especially as we create more competition. I think that will only diminish the returns. But I think we need to fix our tax structure and make sure we do smart economic development programs. But we need to cut taxes. That's the holy grail.
Mr. DiNapoli.
Well, I think as part of trying to keep the recovery on track, the state has been involved with many initiatives to promote economic development, particularly upstate. I think it's a good time now that a couple of years have passed for us to take a look at those economic development programs, make a judgment as to what perhaps is working and what's not. What we've tried to do in terms of the powers of my office today is direct more of those pension fund dollars, again, because we're well funded and we're big, we're able to be creative. And I've directed our staff, look for investment opportunities right here in New York State. We have our in-state investment program program. It's a private equity program. We're invested now in 282 companies across New York State. It's been a great way for us to get that double bottom line of growing jobs in New York, making money for the pension fund. About 45% of those investments go north of the downstate suburbs, so I think it's been a positive for upstate communities to work with our universities, to work with the emerging tech industry, doing more for small businesses. We do small business lending, again, pension fund dollars with the New York Business Development Corporation, and I've added more money to that program. So in the areas that are directly under responsibility, we've been very focused on trying to keep this economy growing in the right direction.
Go beyond for just a minute, beyond the powers of, strictly speaking, powers of your office. Was Mr. Antonacci right that you don't think hydraulic fracturing is a good idea?
My time in the legislature spent a great deal of my legislative work on environmental issues, especially coming from Long Island, where we're a sole source aquifer community. Water quality is a very, very important issue. I think there have been some questions that have not been answered in terms of the possible impact on water quality. So I certainly would take a cautious approach to the fracking question. Obviously, there's been more requirement for study that hasn't been completed in our state. So I think the fact that it hasn't happened yet is better that we go deliberate and take a conservative approach. We've seen problems happen in other states. We don't want to see a destruction of our environment happen here in New York.
I disagree. He has used the pension fund to push companies around to do different types of reports for fracking and go back in and change their policies on fracking. Fracking is safe in a lot of states. It's been going on for 20, 30 years. We need to talk about it because we need to save this economy. We have a gold mine underneath our feet. Now, what I've committed to as the next New York State Comptroller is a green audit team, and we will designate individuals with the experience, not only from an engineering standpoint, but from a financial standpoint, to audit fracking and make sure that it's safe and done the way it's supposed to be done.
I mean, if I might, I don't know what that means. The controller would have no authority to go to a private company that's drilling for shale gas. You have no responsibility there. There's nothing to audit. Your work as an auditor is for government entities. That's why this office is set up the way it is. So, to throw something like that out there, and I don't think there's anything irresponsible about saying companies should ensure best practices, have emergency preparedness, disclose to communities what chemicals are being used well by well if fracking is going on. That's responsible stewardship.
Well, how's that any different than auditing them, Tom? How can you say that you're going to do those things but not audit it? So I don't see the difference.
That's not an order. That's not an order. That's an engagement with a corporation to make sure they're doing best practices. That's not going in there with an order just saying we're going to audit you. You can't audit a private company. You have no power to do that as state controller, nor should you.
You can oversee those companies that are in hydrofracking just like you can do what you're doing.
You're not the DEC. The DEC, the Department of Health and others. You are running for New York State Controller. You're not running for DEC Commissioner or Commissioner of Health.
But Mr. DiNapoli, I mean, when you speak, when the state controller speaks, it's with a roar, even if you're whispering, right? I mean, you're controlling $176 billion and, a seemingly innocent request for more information about what's in the hydraulic fracturing fluid or what are your best practices or what safety devices or other means you're going to put in place can really have a chilling effect on a company or an industry, right?
I would disagree with your characterization. I think it has a responsible effect at making sure that corporations are being good corporate citizens, and it protects our investment if it's a company we're invested in, because if they're not using best practices, if they are going to be open to lawsuits or other kinds of liability, that compromises our shareholder value. So that's being responsible to look for businesses to invest in that have sustainable business practices. That's doing the right thing. That's neither whispering nor roaring nor intimidating. That's just saying if we're going to put our money that our pensions are going to depend on in your company, we better make sure that you are being a good corporate citizen.
Okay. Thank you, Liz.
Okay. Now we get back to that question that I said we would get back to. This is to you, Mr. DiNapoli. It has been widely reported that you and the governor don't always see eye to eye, or perhaps have had not the smoothest relationship over time. He did decline to endorse you 4 years ago. So far, he has not endorsed you this year, I don't believe.
Well, I think it was pretty clear at the convention that he said that we need Tom DiNapoli to continue as state controller. As I said, we need Andrew Cuomo to continue as governor.
Okay. But beyond that, right, you haven't done joint campaign appearances or any of that, right?
I've had my own schedule of campaign appearances.
Fair enough. So the fact that you're maybe at odds from time to time, does that influence your willingness to audit executive agencies, do you believe, which undoubtedly would worsen things between you? I mean, how do you navigate that sort of rocky shoal? Because we're talking about a person who's very powerful, obviously, and has a long memory.
Well, you know, I said at the outset one of the key attributes of this office and the right person being is independence. So, you know, if you look traditionally at those controllers who've been effective, they don't get any medals for being cozy with whoever is the governor at any given time. You know, I've served now with 3 different governors, and I think it's fair to say that with each of those governors, there were issues with, we didn't see eye to eye. We would put out a budget report that they weren't happy with. We would do an audit of an executive agency that they weren't happy with. But that's my job. My job is to provide accountability, to provide an independent point of view. And that hasn't changed with whoever the governor is. And I think we've been very forthright in the work that we've been doing. And we're going to continue to be an independent voice and follow the money and call the shots as we see them.
Is there a specific audit of an executive agency that has occurred over the last 4 years that you and the governor have really been at odds over?
Well, you know, I think all you have to do is look at the responses of the various agencies, and there are any number of them. I think all you need to do is look at the responses to our budget reports. Often it's done through surrogates, perhaps a spokesperson from an agency or from the division of the budget where there's been a sharp disagreement. There are any number of them, but you know, that's our job. It doesn't matter if someone doesn't like what we're doing, as long as what we're doing is done in a professional way, in a clear way where we're looking out to protect the taxpayer interest. We're not looking to win a popularity contest with the second floor. That's not our job.
Just before I let this go, do you believe you've actually teamed up with State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, who is sort of piggybacking on your ability to issue subpoenas? His office doesn't have that power when it comes to public corruption cases. He wants it, I would say, fairly badly. His predecessor, Andrew Cuomo, wanted it fairly badly too, and actually sent someone to a hearing that I believe the legislature held to testify. I think it was Steve Cohen, his former chief of staff, and who said, I need this power and I need the governor to give it to me. Now he is governor and he has declined to give that power to Eric Schneiderman. Should he, in your opinion?
Well, you know, I think the issue of public integrity and public corruption is one of the key issues of our time. So anything that could provide more oversight and responsibility there, I think, would be appropriate, including giving the Attorney General more explicit authority. It's not so much the subpoena power, it's our ability to confer criminal jurisdiction. And that's a power that we've had and used with when Andrew Cuomo was Attorney General. Certainly, as you point out, we have a very unique, unprecedented partnership with Attorney General Schneiderman, where from the beginning of a process, we collaborate, we have a joint task force on public integrity, dozens of elected, appointed officials, heads of nonprofits have been charged. Money has been recovered because of that partnership. It's worked very well. We also have partnerships. We don't have to confer criminal jurisdiction on a U.S. attorney or a DA, but that's part of our very broad work. Anything we could do to be on top of the public integrity issue, we have a role to play. The prosecutors do as well. Unfortunately, there's a lot of work for us to do in this area.
Mr. Antonacci, if you are elected, you possibly will be the lone Republican statewide official. It's highly likely you would be. You know, you would have to then navigate a different sort of relationship because you would be at odds, obviously, with the Democrats inherently because of political differences. But I'm curious, before you respond in terms of Mr. DiNapoli's answer, would you continue that relationship with the state controller, assuming that the state controller, the state attorney general, assuming that person was Eric Schneiderman?
Sure. Can I respond to his comments first?
Please do.
I do think it was humorous that the governor put in campaign finance only for the comptroller's race. I mean, I think we all got a chuckle for that. But, you know, when the governor passed the budget, when the budget got passed, there was a fictitious $2 billion surplus in the budget. And Mr. DiNapoli, I guess, opined on it. It was kind of it wasn't a roar, certainly. And the governor's office shot back with, they were stale. The comments were stale. Mr. DiNapoli lost a chance right there to really hammer the governor on that type of bogus accounting and stand up for the taxpayers, because there's no $2 billion surplus. It's about 83 assumptions that no CPA, no accounting firm would ever agree exists. So, and then he's not auditing the signature programs of the governor, like Startup New York, which I think is just destined for failure. But with regard to Attorney General Schneiderman, if he's in office on January 1st and I'm the comptroller, I will absolutely work with him. I will work with whoever the governor is, because we need to move New York State forward.
Mr. DiNapoli?
Well, I was just, Startup New York is a new program, so we have to wait for a program to be around for a while to do auditing, because when you audit, you look back. And I think I appreciate my opponent pointing out the rebuke that we received from the second floor. And that makes my point. We're not saying things just to curry favor with the second floor. We were the first ones to say those numbers aren't necessarily valid numbers. And in fact, we continue to say in our budget report, we see out-year budget gaps. That's neither roaring nor whispering. That's just telling it like it is, calling the numbers as we see it. That's our job.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay. Juan Manuel.
Thank you. You both belong to very different political parties with very different political ideas. Mr. Antonacci, would you base your investment decisions on your political ideas? And what comes first? Investment returns or political principles?
Tom and I are so different that he says controller and I say comptroller. So we're going to base investments on one thing, the return to the taxpayers. I won't go in there with any political agenda, with any political bent. The Common Retirement Fund needs to reduce the cost to taxpayers. It needs to make sound investments that make sense, that are as riskless as possible. That's what I will do, and that's what we need to do.
So no matter what the company is doing, that company you're investing on?
As long as the company is complying with all federal and state laws, that's going to be our standard. I mean, certainly they have to comply with our laws. I mean, we're not going to invest in somebody who's breaking the law or not doing the right thing there.
How about you?
Well, when you're a trustee, you're a fiduciary, and your responsibility, it's very clear under law and statute, is that your responsibility is to do what's in the best interest of the members of the plan. That's not taxpayers, that's not political interest, that's not anything else. You have to look out what's for the best interest of the members of the plan. What we try to do in that context, of course, is maximize return. And I believe that maximizing return includes keeping an eye on your portfolio companies, and if you have companies that are not exhibiting responsible corporate behavior, be it on environmental issues, as we talked about a little bit, on human rights issues, including equality for lesbian and gay employees, on worker rights in this country and around the globe, if they are not doing best practices on disclosure of political spending, you go down the long list of the issues that are out there that are all tied to best practices that ensure that your investment is sustainable for the long term. So the responsibility always is your fiduciary responsibility in the best interest of the members of the fund and maximizing return. But you need to look out for those other issues as well, because you really can't separate them.
So you would put political principles over investment returns in some cases?
No, just the opposite. We do investment is the first priority. But if we're invested in a company, keep in mind, we do a great deal through index funds, for instance. So you let the index ride, that's as a buy and hold investor, that's often what you do. So if you're invested in a company like BP that has a Gulf oil spill, and you've raised concerns that they haven't had best practices, they haven't had emergency preparedness, now they're liable to all these lawsuits and recoveries, and the value of your holding and your stock goes down, then it does require you to step up and say, hey, company, you better do more. That's why we're co-lead plaintiff in a class action suit against BP. So it starts with where we're invested, and we want to stay invested for the long term. But if issues come up, we want to hold the companies we invest in to a very high standard.
If I could respond. First of all, there's in my data, in one of my press releases, we did some research, and there was a report from 2002 that said that basically funds that have high levels of shareholder activism don't return as much as funds that don't. Mr. DiNapoli leads the league in shareholder activism. And as a matter of fact, when you compare him to CalPERS, which is a much larger fund, they don't have as much shareholder activism, or the New York State teachers, our returns are less than those funds. So I would argue that his activism is actually costing those beneficiaries money.
Well, a CPA should look at numbers, right? We are the best funded. I will compare our funded status to those other plans you cited. Look at the Moody's report that just came out. The 25 largest pension funds in the country, we're the best funded. New York is #1. I think we're doing something right.
So you wouldn't deny that you're practicing shareholder activism in some instances?
It's part of protecting our investment. If we're investing in a company that's doing everything right, we don't need to be engaged as a shareholder. If we're investing in a company that can do better, if there are issues of diversity of their board, if there are issues in terms of how they treat their employees.
Because that's principle, correct? That's a political principle.
But the investment decision to invest there was made by our investment staff. And as I said, often with our public equities, these are part of the index funds that we're invested in.
But would you
part of our
consider
holdings.
that?
But we don't shy away from being an active shareholder if it's going to protect our investment.
would you say that that's basically a policy decision? Because
sure.
a few minutes ago you said that we are not the office to make policy choices.
Yes, no, it's a policy decision, and those policies that we adhere to as part of how we are involved as a shareholder, how we vote at shareholder meetings, that's on our website. It's very clear as to where we set our priorities on worker issues, non-discrimination issues, environment issues. Go down the long list. We're very transparent about what our priorities are, and I think they're consistent with our fiduciary responsibility to protect our investment and to look out for the long-term best interests for the members of our pension fund.
You have the last word if you want.
I'll just say Chevron. Mr. DiNapoli has overstepped in his shareholder activism. Chevron filed a complaint against him. I mean, that's the kind of things that we're seeing out there. He has to do the best thing for the taxpayers of the state of New York.
I will not be intimidated by a big oil company. That's part of my independence and part of my fiduciary responsibility.
Okay, thank you. Jimmy.
Thank you. Local governments, particularly upstate, are feeling financially squeezed. They say that a combination of an erosion of their industrial base, the imposed 2% cap on local property tax increases, as well as flat levels of state aid, have led to some pretty tough choices. Governor Andrew Cuomo has responded to their calls by creating a fiscal restructuring board, and he is promising next year to put the largest amount of money we have yet seen, $500 million, on the table to try and incentivize consolidations and mergers among local governments. As Comptroller, would you push for either of these courses of action, or perhaps a different course? What do you see the role of the Office of Comptroller in assisting or advocating for municipalities that may be strained? And this question goes to Mr. DiNapoli first.
Yeah. Well, we've done a lot of work in this area. We've issued reports that have pointed out a number of situations across the state where shared services arrangements have been entered into, and in fact there's been a good return for taxpayers and services continue to be provided. We did a report that particularly looked at back office operations, IT functions, how that could be consolidated across jurisdictional lines. We've talked about opportunities to share administrative personnel. We provided technical assistance to communities that have come to us that have asked for guidance as to how they could do it right. I have always felt that incentivizing opportunities to share services is the smarter way to go, instead of trying to do it with a heavy hand or try to have Albany be like Big Brother and say, well, this would be better for you if you dissolve your village. Instead say, we can help make the numbers work with an incentive. If it's a school district, could be more money through a school aid formula, or it could be a grant. We do sit on the Local Government Restructuring Board. As you know, Jimmy, we are part of that process. There have been grants offered there. I've also said that it seems to me that as we have a better state budget picture and improved economy and more revenue, we've seen increases for some local governments, like school districts, very significant in this past year. It's time for us perhaps to look at the AIM formula, which is aid incentives to municipalities. It's revenue sharing for our villages, our towns, and our cities. It's a much smaller a much smaller amount of money than school aid, but certainly an increase there, if we have the revenues, would be a way to help local governments navigate through a tough time.
Mr. Antonacci.
Well, back home in Onondaga County, I started what I call the CSI task force. That stands for Consolidation, Shared Services, and Integration of Municipal Governments. And we had to borrow CSI because accountants just don't have TV shows. It's always the doctors or the lawyers. But we're very serious about our fund, and we conduct these studies at no cost to the municipality. But what we need to do, to be honest, is it's always a blame game. Local governments blame the state says we got too many local governments. Well, let's talk about that. The governor says we have 10,000 local governments. That is simply not the case. We don't have mayors of sewer districts and town boards that are of lighting districts. We have approximately just a tad over 3,000 local governments. So that's not the problem. The problem is the rules that the state imposes on these local governments. We can have all the consolidation we want, and if these governments have to operate under the same rules that they're operating under now, I'm talking about things like the WIC statute, which by the way is 100 years old. So we want modern governments with a 100-year-old statute that just doesn't reflect the times. We can talk about prevailing wage, the Triborough Amendment, the Taylor Law. All of these laws pass on cost to municipalities. Until we take out those cost drivers, we can talk about consolidation to the cows come home, because it's not going to work.
Well, the governor's talking about $500 million for consolidation. Is that a good use of state resources?
No, because we have to change the rules. The governor balked on binding interest arbitration. He had a chance to pass it through, and he balked. He ran away from it. Binding interest arbitration is a tremendous cost driver. I could actually argue with binding interest arbitration that bigger is not necessarily better. It takes away the economies of scale because of the negotiations that those larger entities would have under that method.
the Comptroller just suggested we should look at an increase in AIM funding for our cities, in essentially sharing more of the state's revenue with cash-strapped municipalities. Do you agree?
You know, we'll take the check, we'll cash it, but that's not what the problem is.
Looking at what the state has done, there are people who say that the state has not done enough, that there perhaps need to be underlying changes, as you suggested, Mr. Antonacci, or that there has to be more cash. Comptroller, do you feel that we have done enough to help our cities, places like Syracuse, Rochester?
You know, as you know, Jimmy, we instituted a unique program that other states are now starting to follow on fiscal stress monitoring, because we want to be ahead of the curve to identify municipalities, school districts, certainly including our cities, that may be headed for a full financial crisis. New York has never had a bankruptcy. We don't ever want to have a Detroit happen in our state. And I believe our monitoring system now in its second year has been an effective way to make sure local officials are aware of what's happening in their community, let taxpayers and citizens be more aware of what's happening, and I hope it will inform the broader policy discussion that will go on with the legislature and the governor, certainly at budget time when they're looking at issues like what's the partnership with the state and the cities, should we be putting more money to help them out? So I think while the state's in a little better shape and we have more work to do, the stress point really is at the local government level, particularly our cities, and we do need to do more. We have an obligation to do more for our cities.
Mr. Antonacci, do you continue the fiscal stress monitoring?
I won't say that it's not an effort on Mr. DiNapoli's part to have an early warning system, but he's a weatherman in that case, okay? We're letting people know that we're stressed. We already know that we're stressed. Incidentally, Syracuse, city of Syracuse, where our mayor constantly tells us how underwater the city is not on that watch list. The problem with the stress test is it's got the basics in there: fund balance, tax ratios, all that stuff that you can look at without a stress test. The bottom line is there's no solutions. We need solutions, and we know what the solutions are. We just don't have the political will to implement them.
Well, not everybody knows that they have a problem, and sometimes the citizens aren't made aware because the local officials don't tell them. There's nothing wrong. In fact, it makes sense to have that early warning system because we want to avoid a Detroit happening here. We want more information out there. That's how you empower people. That's how you have a more enlightened discussion. We've got great thought leaders on issues of cities like Mayor Stephanie Miner, who certainly is eloquent on the struggles that she's facing, but has been identifying the problems that are emerging down the road. Because she's smart and creative, she's keeping Syracuse in good shape. That's why they don't end up in stress on our system. But she's identified the kind of issues that we need to look at if we can ensure that Syracuse will not be in some level of stress down the road. She's called for a more thoughtful discussion involving all stakeholders on this issue. I think the time would be right for that.
Okay, thanks very much. Gentlemen, we have only a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask a final question and ask for a quick response. There are several big capital plans being discussed that have some big numbers missing, and that includes a new Tappan Zee Bridge with no indication of what the toll might be, and a $32 billion MTA capital plan that has only half of the funding designated. Does the state run an economic risk by launching major projects without the funding and those numbers fully in place? And if so, what actions or warnings would you use as controller to warn against or curb the practice? We'll start with you, Mr. DiNapoli.
Well, certainly we are very much on the MTA. It's a very important service for our regional economy. We issue regular reports on the financial condition of the MTA and certainly on its capital plan, and we identify that there would be a gap. But it's part of a planning process. What the MTA has to do is make sure that everything that's in the capital plan they can stand behind, and as happened with the last capital plan that also started to not be fully funded, figure out how they're going to close the gap that's there. The caution that I have put out there is that too often in the past the MTA has relied on more borrowing, and the result is debt service is a growing part of the MTA expense, so I would continue to put that out there as a cautionary tale. I do think, and I know there are a lot of problems at Washington, but the reality is we do need to work with our federal delegation. We need more of a partnership coming out of Washington to support public transit for our city and for our region and for regions all across the state. You know, the Tappan Zee Bridge is another issue. We have made clear that the Thruway Authority needs to fully disclose the financing plan, including what will be the impact on tolls.
Okay, Mr. Antonacci, 1 minute.
Mr. DiNapoli signed off on the Tappan Zee contract with no details. signed off on it, got it started, no plan on how to pay it. We still, to this day, don't know how to pay it. And as a matter of fact, the federal government has denied our loan from the fund that we requested it from. So I don't know where that's going. But we need to invest in our infrastructure. Mr. DiNapoli just issued a report talking about infrastructure needs in the state of New York. And in there was, in fairness, just a little blip about the cost of prevailing wage. Didn't really make the press release or really get highlighted, but it was just alluded to. That's the problem, the cost of construction, the cost of our government. We need to lower that, and we can't have as recommendations simply go ask the federal government for more money, which was one of the recommendations in the report. We need a hard stimulus. We need to take the fines and penalty money and put it all towards infrastructure.
Okay. Thank you both gentlemen for keeping to that time. We're going to allow you your minute for closing statements, and we'll start with you, Mr. DiNapoli.
Thank you. The Comptroller's office is not just about numbers. It's about making government work better for you and your family. That's what I've been devoted to during my time as your state controller. Managing the pension fund with openness, transparency, and integrity, restoring the reputation of that fund after a big scandal, and growing the fund to a record high value and the best funded status, as has been acknowledged in many, many reports among all the big states in our country. That's good news for taxpayers and certainly for our public workers and public retirees. Keeping a bullseye on public corruption. Just over the past 2 years, 80 arrests, $12 million recovered in taxpayer money, and we're still on the job rooting out corruption when we find it. Uncovering waste, fraud, and abuse of taxpayer dollars with our audits, with our reports. We're dedicated to making government more efficient and using tools like Open Book New York to making transparency real in the state of New York. It's been a privilege to serve as your state controller. I ask for your vote. I ask for your support. I love this job. There's more work that I want to do to move New York forward as your state controller.
Thank you. Mr. Antonacci.
Mr. DiNapoli, you've been a gentleman. It's been a pleasure running against you. I can't believe an hour's up. I never thought we would have enough material, but it's been a great evening, and I really appreciate the audience for paying attention and for our esteemed panel. I want to thank my family again for this run that has been historic, and it's been a privilege to run for New York State Comptroller. Our state is in trouble. We need to do business differently. I ask that you elect a certified public accountant, an attorney that does the job in Onondaga County, that has proven that he can do the job that I've done in Onondaga County, to be your next state controller. Why? Because we need to be honest about our problems. We need to identify those problems with specificity. We need to talk about the rules that govern us that are expensive and cost drivers. Only then can we cut government down to where it needs to be. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for this debate. I'd like to thank the candidates for joining us tonight. And a reminder, Election Day is Tuesday, November 4th. Again, we'd like to thank City University, Baruch College, and the city's Campaign Finance Board for helping us with tonight's debate. The next live statewide debate will be on Thursday, October 30th. That's in the race for State Attorney General. Thanks for watching, and have a great evening.
This has been a special presentation of Time Warner Cable News, Time Warner Cable News New York 1, and Time Warner Cable Noticias New York 1. A special thanks to City University's Baruch College.